Good evening. You're either watching or listening to Redwood Wonk. Dave, Frank, and I are going to discuss the national news of the day. There are a number of big stories. We're going to start with the pending spending bill, again, this keeps coming up over and over again. But it looks like Mike Johnson, who is the Speaker of the House right now, has had to strike a deal, possibly with Democrats. There may be more Democrats voting for this than Republicans by the time it's done. I'm going to let Dave break down what's proposed and what's likely to pass because he is actually much more read up on it than I am. So, Dave?
Sure. Thanks for that intro. The short version is that there has been a tentative agreement reached, and with the emphasis on tentative, between House Republicans and Senate Democrats. And basically, they've agreed to a combined budget that would be slightly more military spending and slightly less discretionary spending. And this is in line with the negotiation that was already sealed last May between the Democrats and the Republicans. So really, the Speaker Johnson, he said his goal is to close the border and make sure we reduce non-defense discretionary spending. So it's like 0.2% less discretionary spending, and I think it's like 3% more. They're quibbling over the exact number. They've agreed to 1.59 trillion for fiscal year 2024, which is now, which again, that was already reached in the debt ceiling negotiation last year. But it's slightly more. It's 1.66 trillion if you factor in the side deal. That's kind of inside baseball, but it gives each side the ability to say, "Hey, we came through, give or take $70 billion." That we're not going to agree that that's what we've agreed to. So there's one thing also worth mentioning here is that that's just the top line number. And the reality is that there are 12 separate spending bills that they have to actually write and vote on, agree to. With
Are they actually already written at this point, or um, no?
Yeah, they according to what I've seen, they haven't sorted it all out yet. I mean, we're talking massive bills, so they probably have the boilerplate in place, and they've got to arrange which numbers are going to go where, the dot the i's and cross the t's on which departments get funded to what levels. But because it's mostly from the same as 2023, give or take in terms of the dollar amounts, it's really just again i's and t's. But like I was about to say, there are two caveats here. One is that there's deadlines. So back in December, which seems so long ago, they had a continuing resolution that they agreed to avoid a partial government shutdown. Well, that partial government shutdown is again upon us. January 19th, just a week or so away, and February 2nd, several weeks away. So the idea is that they will have to really move fast.
Right, and Republicans are in a little bit of a political bind here because not every poll maybe, but a number of polls have suggested that if the government does shut down, Republicans will be blamed for it by the majority of voters. So they are in a jam because they are being dogged by, again, the far right Freedom Caucus elements, people who are in districts that really aren't going to be a challenge. They're not facing tough re-elections, so why do they care? They don't seem to care all that much about holding on to a Republican majority in the House. So they have more to lose, but the Democrats also don't want to have the government shut down because even though it might help them retain the House, it would probably hurt Joe Biden in the long run if it was to have an economic impact. And Joe Biden does have an improving economy. So many people don't recognize it as such, but he does have an economy where the lowest unemployment rate in history, the market expanding faster, or jobs being expanding faster than any time since the 1960s, and inflation is finally down to about 3%, and possibly will drop even further. So he hasn't been able to sell it to the public, but he doesn't want to shut down to basically complicate any of that.
Yeah, so speaking to the idea of a shutdown, as we've talked about in the past, there is a constituency within the House and the Republican side, the Freedom Caucus. They do engage in a lot of grandstanding, and there is an incentive for them to at least, you know, posture like they would be willing to shut down the government. Certain people are saying different things among that group. Interestingly, there's not like a known finite list of Freedom Caucus members. They don't publish it, but it's believed to be about 45 people. So if they did, as a group, choose to act, what they would do is rather than voting against it necessarily, which could easily be outmaneuvered by Democrats joining the speaker, the Republican speaker, to pass a budget. What's on the table is the potential to vacate the speakership again.
Yeah.
So, as a reminder, we are two people short in the House right now, with both George Santos being ejected, voted out. I don't know if expelled, that's the word. He was expelled. And also Kevin McCarthy resigned. So, former Speaker McCarthy, he's not there anymore. He left the end of last year. So, there are two members down already.
I think
But
it's them to what, two people over the majority at this point.
So I'm looking at the most recent numbers as of December 31st, and they're saying 213 Democrats to 220 Republicans, two vacant. That's 435. So it's seven people. We've talked about the number being very different before, so I'm not really sure exactly, but slightly, not very different, slightly different. But that's the most recent count that I just have. I copied that over. Just I had a feeling we'd talk about it. Um, One of the Freedom Caucus members, Matt Gaetz, he publicly came out and said, if this border is not shut down, then we must shut down the government. So that's him kind of stirring the pot a little bit to kind of flex the power of Freedom Caucus to dictate a little bit about this process. Another quote that came out was, "It's even worse than we thought. This is a total failure." But in fact, it's not something, vacating the speakership is not something that their leader says. Representative Chip Roy from Texas, he said, "I'm leaving it," meaning vacating the speakership, "on the table. I'm not going to say I'm going to file it tomorrow. I think the speaker needs to know that we're angry about it." So they're just trying to say we needed to see more cuts. We could talk more about some of the cuts that but realistically, it looks like this is the only real main spending that's not in this bill that's talked about quite regularly is the spending for Israel, Ukraine. Now they've also lumped in Indo-Pacific defense spending. I guess they mean Taiwan, and also border security. So border security seems to be their hot button issue right now.
Right. And what do they actually propose to do for border security that they want to spend the money on? I mean, are you clear on that?
Well, part of it is grandstanding to a certain extent. We need to shut that border down. So some of the things that we've heard about in the recent past, where they want a revamped asylum process, although asylum is based on international law, so it's not clear exactly how we would redefine asylum. They've also said they want to reform the probation, where people are arrested and then released on their own reconnaissance to come back later. So maybe they want more people to stay detained longer. But realistically, if they are going to spend more money, we're talking about technology. We're talking about judges to process the people quicker.
Right.
And truthfully, most of these people are, the problems that they're having are the people coming through legally, or sorry, through the actual border crossings, the legitimate border crossings. The stuff that is grandstanded about mostly is there's not a lot going on that way. It is a record. I mean, to be fair, to that they're not wrong. 10 to 13,000 people a day is record migration, but it's not clear that there's a actual policy that would be agreed to on a short timeline.
Yeah, no, and as we've discussed on the show before, even the drugs come through the checkpoints. They don't,
Right.
they don't cross the Rio Grande or anything like that. So it's, I mean, maybe occasionally, but very rarely, because that would be silly. So it's, so exactly how they want to spend it. I wish the Democrats would try to flesh this out. What exactly are you talking about? Right? Some of the Freedom Caucus people have been saying, well, we need to militarize the border, rather than Ukraine. And and take care of our own side. Well, what does that mean? You send troops down there. What are they going to do? I mean, it's just again, you've maybe more people to man the checkpoints so that they can check more vehicles or something, but that's about it. So it is grandstanding, and what Johnson has to do is give them something that they can go back and talk to their constituents to say, hey, we held out for this and we got it.
Yeah, and again, it's another topic. The migration problem and the border security problem. It's a different topic, but there are people proposing things like, hey, we need to go back to some of the Trump era policies where we just figure out a way to have the people not come to the U.S. as quickly, possibly house them in Mexico, come to an arrangement with Mexico, or work with other border areas, other countries' borders, and make a sort of more international investments. But I think a comprehensive, that's not in scope for this budget negotiation.
No. Why don't we talk about some of the proposed cuts? Of course, they want to lower what's referred to as discretionary spending, which is basically not fixed costs that aren't defense. Not, Social Security is baked in. They got to spend money on that. Medicare is baked in. Certain elements of the military spending apparently is baked in, but discretionary spending is where you've got some give. Also, the financing the deficit is not discretionary. So the discretionary, I think they're going to run out of places to cut other than the military, but they absolutely do not want to cut discretionary spending in the military. They've said that specifically, non-defense discretionary spending, and I'm not even sure they include. Well, VA services aren't discretionary anyway. I mean, so what is the take on this?
Well, one of the things that they did already agree to in theory is that there was $80 billion set aside for IRS enforcement over a 10-year period. So that's about $8 billion a year. In this agreement is that they would cut $20 billion out of that. So, whatever that works out to, a little over 10% of it, to 12% of it or something. So that's a win, although it's a win in air quotes because in reality, it will take away the ability to enforce, I think the term that I saw was here it is, sophisticated and wealthy tax cheats. So they're really cutting off their nose to spite their face.
Right. I mean, because how's that going to impact the deficit if they can't collect those taxes?
Right.
I mean,
right.
So.
And there's a lot of small stuff. Like I said, you and I have talked about it before, where they want to sort of threaten civil rights policies in the Defense Department, for example, which are small potatoes, really, when it comes to. They're already agreeing to give the Defense Department an extra $28 billion more than last year. So how much are they really holding up defense spending over domestic, small domestic disagreements about, for example, LGBT people or abortion services? Those are again, I hate to say grandstanding, but some people are obviously negotiating out of principle. But in the big picture, that's not in a $1.7 trillion budget, whether or not the government is going to be generous in its conception of civil rights. That's not really going to move the needle.
I did see that a couple of them are already trying to use the Austin not reporting as cancer as an example of woke affirmative action, diversity hiring, which is just absolutely ridiculous. But that's what they're using it to angle for cutting back on the woke policies in the Pentagon. Whatever that means.
Right. I do have one interesting thing to point out. January 19th deadline is for agriculture, transportation, energy, and veterans. So to resist a continuing resolution would hurt those people in the short term. And then the February 2nd deadline is for commerce, justice, defense, homeland security, labor, state, interior, and financial services. So although the Republicans won't want to, in theory, won't want a continuing resolution, it's really just hurting their constituents if they don't come up with a solution.
Oh, if the Democrats go out swinging about how the Republicans are grandstanding to deny veterans their benefits. That is not something they want to fight.
Right.
Except if you're in the Freedom Caucus, where you are going to be reelected no matter what. But that's a bind.
Order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival. That's an official act in order to SEAL Team 6.
He would have to be and would speedily be, impeached and convicted before the criminal prosecution.
What if he weren't? There would be no criminal prosecution, no criminal liability for that.
Chief Justice's opinion in Marbury against Madison and our constitutional tradition and the plain language of the impeachment judgment clause all clearly presuppose that what the founders were concerned about was not.
I asked you a yes or no question. Could a president who ordered SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival who was not impeached, would he be subject to criminal prosecution?
If he were impeached and convicted first. And
so your answer is
no.
So we've reported on this show that Donald Trump was able to get a ruling, or has appealed a ruling with regard to his claim to absolute immunity as president. His attorneys, with a straight face, the other day argued to the appellate court. It was originally Jack Smith was trying to get this fast tracked. This is, of course, claim that a president is absolutely immune to charges when he is president. It's it's something that Nixon tried to advance at one point, but backed off it. But Trump is pushing that in this time. The Supreme Court, for whatever reason, declined to expedite it, so it is with the appellate court, I believe the Fifth Circuit, and the and he made 10th Circuit. I'm sorry. It made his arguments the other day with the attorney with a straight face, saying that the president could order the assassination of a political opponent and could only be removed from office by impeachment and can't be charged for it because he was president. This is based on it's certainly not a textualist argument. There's nothing in the Constitution that says that, and it's hard to get where they're trying to imply it, but this is what he's saying, and then he's reporting it. I don't know what the political fallout of this is. He once made the comment that he could shoot somebody on 7th Avenue and his fans would support him. It boggles the mind that he really wanted to go this way. But again, most scholars are saying it's not likely that even the conservative majority Supreme Court will go along with this argument, but the intent is to delay it, to get a delay in the trial so that he can push the trial back possibly until after he's elected president.
Exactly. So this is a great segue to the fact that he really is probably trying to play out the clock more than anything else. But his legal team, when you listen to the arguments, I heard some of the recordings in front of the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. There's 3 judges. One is a Bush appointee, Judge Henderson, and 2 are Biden appointees, Judges Pan and Childs. So interesting comments came from them. It sounded like they really were skeptical. I mean, I think that's the consensus, is that they were skeptical. But the terms of what they were skeptical about, I think, are pretty interesting. So even the Republican, air quotes, the Republican appointed anyway, judge, she said, I think it's paradoxical to say that his constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed allows him to violate criminal law. So it's like on the face of it, like he can't just go, any leader can't just commit crimes indiscriminately once they've taken an oath to defend the law. Like again, the judge used the word paradox. There was another one that said, Judge Pan says, well, so the line of questioning was, could they ever be held criminally liable? And then Trump's lawyer said, well, if they're impeached first, So it's separation of powers issue. You leave it up to Congress, and if there is an impeachment, well, then there's grounds for potentially a criminal prosecution. So I think he said a qualified yes was how he answered it. So then this leads to the Judge Henderson Judge Pan says, well, once you concede that they can be prosecuted under some circumstances, your separation of power argument falls away. So it's like this is not a legal theory that holds up. You can't. It's like it's inconsistent, So we could go back and forth. I'll let you comment on any of the other legal elements that you're aware of, if you'd like.
Well, it's. I mean, it really is pretty obvious that there is nothing. If you're a textualist or if your original intent, I don't think anybody, if they intended for the president to be a sovereign, that Hobbes had in mind in writing Leviathan, where he is the law, they could have said that. And they would have said that outright, and it wouldn't have been popular. Nobody would have agreed to that. The impeachment process is next to impossible to obtain. It's a political process, not a judicial process. Whoever is running the Senate gets to dictate how the trial is conducted, and you need to get 60 votes, and the most bipartisan decision of any president of impeachment of any impeachment so far has been the second one against Trump, where 57 senators voted for it, including 7 Republicans, which it doesn't it's just there's no guarantee that it's not a good source of due process. So if the founders had intended for the impeachment process to be due process, they would have provided a lot more detail and some standards upon which it had to be done, and maybe had some judicial involvement in it. At least have a Supreme Court justice, maybe the head justice, preside over it. But he only presided over it. It was almost token. Mitch McConnell really presided over it in terms of the real power there, and not Roberts. So McConnell refused to allow for discovery, and the rest. So for the founders to have relied on what is essentially a political process to keep a president in check that way just doesn't seem likely at all. Even especially if you're a conservative. If you adopt one of the two conservative philosophies of the Constitution, in that either you go with the original text and the plain basic meaning of it, or original intent, and it doesn't stand up to either of those.
So the judges did spend some of their time kind of making, hey, maybe we ought to do this, maybe we ought to do that. One was procedural and one was, substantive. So the procedural one issue that came up was, well, typically criminal defendants don't actually appeal issues until after their trial. So that was Judge Childs. She basically said that Supreme Court precedent is that we don't actually rule on immunity now, that we send it back to trial, they have a trial, and then the appeal process would start. So even though that's more delays, they do have one avenue, which is, well, what are we even going to find on? So when they were looking for things to have a finding on, that's when they came to a substantive issue, which was maybe we send it back to to Judge Chutkan in the trial court and say, okay, Trump's attorneys are saying that he was in this was part of his official duties, and the official duties are exempt, and so what we could do is we could say, is there anything in this case at all? What are these in the indictment, rather, that are even remotely, I think the word was plausibly, official duties? So then Judge Chutkan could say, actually, I'm gonna find that there's nothing here that's an official duty, and then it goes back to the appeals court, and then they could say, we agree with you, there's nothing here that's an official duty, and then leave it up to Trump to give that to the Supreme Court.
Right.
So there's a lot of potential delays baked into the cake here.
The potential duty, I'm kind of surprised it didn't come up, because there is something that was an official duty, but I don't know if it's a charge based on it or they just cited it as part of their overall narrative. But his attempt to appoint a sham attorney general was in the course of an official duty, even though the person is totally not qualified and is even a co-conspirator and alleged in the charges. It is not. That's about as much as they could say if that was part of the quote unquote or part of in terms of what he's being charged with. But again, they're very specific about what he's being charged with, and not everything in the narrative that they provide as a factual background is intended to amount to a charge or even elements of a charge. Other than that, there's really not much else you could argue was in official duty. But of course, Trump wants to say just his making a speech was official duty to him. You know, that's part of the job, right? I mean, again, it just goes to the fact that no, they're not going to win this, and they know it. It's just to run out the clock.
Yeah, and so with that in mind, the trial date is scheduled for March 4th, which, you know, it's not right away, but it's relatively soon. Yeah. So there's the question of will this end up back with the Judge Chutkan's courtroom by then or not? And again, I'm not a court observer. I don't know exactly how this works, but I think this DC Court of Appeals doesn't really. They seem to really ready to just move it along. Like from their perspective, they're almost incredulous that this is even a thing. But they have to go through their due diligence, exhaust all the options of what to consider. I don't know about you, but I don't know what they would end up sending other than just saying no. You know, you're not exempt. There's no official duties we observed, but they're probably a little bit reluctant to find on these matters. But at the same time, it seems like it's just a time waster. I don't know what the right word for that is, but frivolous. It seems frivolous. There you go. And so why would you pass a frivolous lawsuit up to the Supreme Court? In theory, they'll probably look for a way to send it back and get things moving.
But if they send it back, he's just going to appeal again. I don't know that that's going to speed anything up. I mean, the quickest thing for them to wait for them to do it is to issue their ruling now, send it up, and if the Supreme Court is interested in not getting caught up in this and not appearing biased, they just will refuse to hear it. They won't grant cert. I mean, they could be tired of all the stuff that Trump is sending up anyway. As we've discussed on the show before, they really can only take at the maximum maybe 140 cases a year, period, total. So how much of the time do they want to be wasting on Trump's craziness? I imagine that at least a couple of the justices are thinking that of the conservative majority. So I think that would be the fastest. Issue a decision, send it up, and because the Supreme Court doesn't even have to be in session officially to reject a claim. They need to have a quorum, but they can. There's ways they can do that without having to wait until they're in session and send it back down. I noticed that so far the judge has not changed the trial date.
Right.
But again, there hasn't been a formal motion, but a judge can do it on their own motion.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting case, but yet at the same time, it appears on the merits that when your lawyers are saying you can do anything, that doesn't hold water. I would hope it doesn't hold water for any of the Supreme Court justices.
I would hope so too. That will be a 9. I think a 9-0 one coming back. Find it kind of interesting because they're going to have to deal. They've taken the Colorado case, and there's some indication. I have thought that the Supreme Court is going to rule on Trump's behalf on it, but they're taking the case about a month. I think it's supposed to be argument for February 8th. I think the ballots are supposed to be written by then, and the actual election is March 5th. So they've got to be real careful about this, in terms of how they're doing it. And if they're waiting that long, there's some suggestion that maybe the Supreme Court is already deciding they don't want to they're not going to overturn it. I don't know, but there's speculation there.
Yeah, there's so many plates spinning, I guess, so to speak, that and like you said, the Supreme Court's only got so much bandwidth here. I don't think they're going to run flack for a lot of the frivolity, like I mentioned earlier. What about the sort of discrepancy between the I don't know if you heard about this, but the state and the federal cases, there's the state case in Georgia. There's been some talk that the prosecutors have been involved in a potential ethical scandal. Have you heard about this at all?
That basically one of the people she appointed to handle part of the case is her lover.
Yeah, you heard it.
She hasn't even responded to it, but Trump is saying, "Oh, that the case should be dismissed on that basis," which is again ridiculous. The worst that could happen is that person will possibly be removed if there is a sort of conflict. If there was indeed a what do you want to call it? I'm forgetting the word, but a hiring that was not ethical, but it has nothing to do with the case itself. So right. I think they're just looking to throw up a smokescreen and again try to slow things down.
Was it
the word I was looking for? Was nepotism?
Yeah, like you said, a smokescreen, and it's just more red meat for people to chew on when they're against the Trump having a day in court down there in Georgia. I think worst case scenario, this guy gets, like you said, he's no longer on the prosecution team, and not much more would likely come of that.
On June 17, 2015, the beautiful souls, five survivors, invited a stranger into this church to pray with them. The word of God was pierced by bullets of hate, of rage, propelled by not just gunpowder, but by a poison that's for too long haunted this nation. What is that poison? White supremacy. Oh, it is. It's a poison. Throughout our history, it's ripped this nation apart. It says no place in America. Not today, tomorrow, or ever.
Okay, that brings us to our final segment. Joe Biden has come out with a couple of very good speeches, very fiery speeches. Well, I wouldn't say fiery, but basically has accused Trump of being willing to sacrifice democracy in order for him to claim power, just as he was willing to sacrifice it to hold on to it a couple of years ago. So he is sort of changing his position, his strategy. Before, the strategy was to maintain to basically talk about how good the economy is doing. That has not helped him in the polls. And there's been a sense coming of the Democrats that he really needs to emphasize the urgency of this. So I wanted to get a discussion going because he's not going to say fascism, but commentators are saying fascism. And this is where we need to discuss what is fascism. It's one of those words that gets misused all the time. I go crazy when I watch science fiction movies and they see something shooting through the sky and they say it's a meteorite. It's not a meteorite. It's a meteor. It's a meteoroid when it's in outer space, a meteorite when it's on the ground, and a meteor when it's flying through the air. And so fascism is one of those terms that's overused. We've discussed that. And it's usually used to discuss a government action that somebody sees as heavy-handed. And the thing is that it really isn't. The original meaning of the word has been kind of lost. There was an actual fascist party in Italy that appointed that supported and brought Mussolini into power. That was a literal fascism. Even technically speaking, the National Socialists weren't fascists, but we use it to describe any type of right-wing ideology that is nationalist, totalitarian, or authoritarian, and a number of other aspects of it. But one of the things that social scientists, and again, you always hear, what is a woman? It depends on the context. Is a tomato a vegetable or a fruit? Depends on if you're talking to a scientist or the government. But what is, what is a fascist? What is an authoritarian? And fascism needs to be understood not as a government action. The government action is the result, is the final product. But what it begins with is a grassroots movement. People don't understand this. It's counterintuitive, led by a charismatic leader, where due process, intellectualism, and bureaucracy and the media are all being attacked at once. When you discuss this as fascism, of course, fascism, to say somebody is a fascist is a very strong word, usually as an insult. There are very few people who would identify themselves as fascists these days, although I have met them. But we need to be real clear as to what it is. And does Trump's movement represent fascism? I've referred to it as proto-fascism, but again, we need to discuss this and what impacts it could have on democratic institutions.
So again, thank you for that setup. I think there's a couple different ways we could go here, and I did refresh my memory from some of the political thinkers who have written about this in the past. I'd like to start with just something more contemporaneous, something closer to the now, something closer to there are people out there speaking out about Trump and about what we're witnessing here in the United States, but also elsewhere around the world in countries like the Philippines and Hungary, et cetera. So there are other places where there's authoritarian leaders that sort of have a cult of personality. One of the thinkers that's been out quite a bit lately is Jason Stanley from Yale, and he wrote a book, How Fascism Works, The Politics of Us and Them. So that was about 5 years ago or so, and he's been out speaking to the Trump phenomena, about the Trump phenomena along the guidelines of his work and what he does. And I got a quote from him, which is, and again, this is just one aspect. There's, dozens of people with definitions. There's but this is one. So we'll start here. A cult of the leader who promises national restoration in the face of humiliation brought on by supposed communist, Marxist, minorities, immigrants who are supposedly posing a threat to the character and history of a nation. And also that the leader proposes that only he can solve it, and all of his political opponents are enemies or traitors. So right. That's a generic sort of, well, it's specific, but it generalizes all the aspects that other people have defined over the last nearly 100 years about fascism in a way that makes sense to project on sort of Trump's rhetoric, Trump's style, the impact of Trumpism. So it may not be, like you said, meteor. It may not be a direct, and in fact, it's not a direct correlation to a fascist regime like we've seen, say, in Italy or Germany during World War II. Other thinkers will talk about Paxton. He projects that onto Vichy France, and I think there's some interesting parallels there too. But what are your thoughts on how to define it this way helps people better come to grips with where we are today?
I think we need to have the discussion, because one of the concerns being raised by the media is how the media isn't really explaining what the magnitude of the events, for instance, on January 6th were. You have Mitt Romney saying, "Oh, don't even bother with this. It's been processed." People have their opinions and they're not going to change it. So, but I think we need to have this discussion. Well, however we want to define it, we need to talk about whether or not it's something that could happen in this country, obviously. And so, I mean, that's my take on it. There is a lack of a sense of urgency on the part, and one of the tenets of any definition of fascism is they attack the media, not just a particular source, not just the New York Times here or La Prensa in Nicaragua or something like that. It is specifically the media. Like there's some grand conspiracy of the media out there to come up with a narrative that defeats Trump, right? That they decided for some arbitrary reason that they don't like him, and so he's the hero. We've got it. We've talked about how we have it in our national culture that there's always bureaucracy and people in the way of somebody getting something done. Usually a cop, maverick cop, right, who breaks the rules all the time, and we respect him for it, right? People don't understand that there is at the root of that a kind of it is a staple of fascism to talk about the hero of one who's going to solve all of the problems and do that. The communist type of totalitarianism, even if there is a single leader, except in rare cases like maybe Cuba with Fidel, there isn't a particularly charismatic character at the top. Stalin wasn't charismatic. I mean, if you ever read anything he wrote, it's pretty basic. He wasn't an intellectual, and he didn't do speeches to inspire. He didn't fire people up. He was an effective leader, and you can go into why he was, but it wasn't the cult of his personality necessarily. It was the cult of the party, and he controlled the party. Fascism requires a leader that you can, that particularly, and most often that plays into the machismo wishes of the fascist culture, of the culture of fascism and authoritarianism. It's really a difficult discussion to have in the limited time that we have, but yes, we need that discussion, and that's how I would respond.
So let's take it to the next step, where I mentioned Robert Paxton from Columbia. And so he's a specialist, I think he's deceased now, a specialist on fascism, but particularly with respect to France, when it was Vichy France, which was in effect part of or complementary to Nazi Germany. And so he says that fascism cannot be considered simply a more muscular form of conservatism, because fascism in power did carry out some changes profound enough to be called revolutionary. So he's talking about things like their fascist negations. You're negating liberalism. You're negating the status quo. You're negating that, in our case today, people that are woke or people that are LGBT friendly, people that are, civil rights are important, that openness, that liberalism. So fascism is going to be opposed to some status quo. Also, they have goals that are to regulate the economic structure, transform social relations, saying that they're more modern, saying that, we are self-determined. We're not going to let other people dictate our future. We are going to, make America great again fits right into that fascist goal model that he talks about, where you're saying these are ways you're going to get people motivated and inspired, and part, that cult of personality around economic opportunism that comes from the state and the nation being raised up above the individual themselves. You're part of something bigger, and that therefore you're bigger. So again, that's a parallel here to this modern era. And finally, fascist style. He talks about that too, which is he called it a political aesthetic. So romantic symbolism, mass mobilization, positive view of violence, promotion of masculinity, youth, and of course, charismatic authoritarian leadership. So the reason I mentioned this one, because it, ironically, I guess, or just luckily, today, the journalist Tom Hartman, who's a progressive journalist, the largest, most widespread one in the world. He's heard in most countries, every military base in the world. He's got his multi-hour show on there. And today his topic was trickle down fascism. America is suffering from an epidemic of political bullying, and he goes on to kind of that Paxton definition that I said, he takes that to the next level, and he talks about, hey, look, Trump has already done these things. This isn't his demeanor, and these things are affecting his followers, and so that plan 2024, it's called, right? 2025, the one where they're talking about firing 50,000 people in the government, replacing them with Volk, common folks who are going to come in and reform the government, with people that sort of the contagiousness of the bullying and that sort of transformative sort of taking away the power of the enemy, of the insidiousness, the insiders. So anyway, there's a lot there to what Tom Hartman was saying, but you could see the infectiousness and impact on the political culture. And so the reason I went through all this, Eric, is just because to me it seems like that's what, when you called this thing Biden comes out swinging, and there was a report that came out that said, look, Obama met with Biden in December and said, you're going to have to step this up. Like the fate of America, the fate of the world depends on you really making the case between two different futures here. And so I think that we're starting to see that speech that you mentioned, one of the speeches that you mentioned, the one in Valley Forge. We could talk a little bit about it, but the idea, the rhetoric was high level rhetoric. They obviously spent an awful long time trying to craft that message. And I'll just say this one last thing. One of the things Biden said was, liberty is not conquest. Freedom is not domination. National independence is not individual glory. So he was basically trying to draw this distinction between the vision of what he purports to represent as our leader versus what they want to project onto Trump going forward, to really kind of wake people up to the threat.
Yeah, I think it's maybe a little bit above most people's heads, but I think that was kind of an oblique reference to the Orwell's 1984, Freedom is Slavery, and the rest.
Yep.
I want to reference something, then we can talk about Biden's speeches. But I think one of the foremost experts on fascism and totalitarianism in general was Hannah Arendt, and her famous quote: "The ideal subject of totalitarian rule is not the convinced Nazi nor the dedicated communist, but people for whom the distinction between fact and fiction, true and false, no longer exists." We have, I think, what was it, a third of Republicans, maybe a third of the nation, I don't know, that believe that the election in 2020 was stolen. We have people who, in Congress saying that this wasn't such a big deal on January 6th. It was they were tourists mostly, and it was and they're even referring to it as a patriotic action. Some of these same Congress people, that for the couple of days after January 6th were slamming Trump, saying he's done, McCarthy included, but we now have to change history. I mean, we are now facing a complete revision of that history as if it was nothing.
Yeah. And to be honest, I got goosebumps when you said that quote, because I was thinking about it, but I couldn't remember it, so I'm glad you did. And so it's interesting you mentioned Orwell, that you thought that that Biden was alluding to Orwell, because as Tom Hartman pointed out in his blast today, former Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, she wrote a book called Fascism: A Warning. And in there she wrote, decades ago, George Orwell suggested that the best one-word description of a fascist was a bully. And I've seen her speak on this before, and the idea, it permeates through the current discourse, I very much think that what you said is right on, that there's plenty of people who are quote unquote true believers, and on both sides, but really it's the people that aren't sure, the people that need to really try to assess facts and assess where we are and kind of come to terms with what their aspirations are for the future. But when there's quicksand under their feet and they can't agree to facts, where do you go? You go to your friends, your family, your whatever, your church, your team. You go all to those folks. But all the folks that kind of need some sense of groundedness in their when you're picking who you're going to vote for, because right now it is very close, and Trump does have the edge in many metrics. So it's pretty clear that there is a lot of work to be done. If the president thinks he's going to hold on to his seat, he's going to have to break through to people and really inspire people to get to the bottom of what their expectations are from this challenge from Trump.
Yeah, Matt chimed in, check the basement for pods. Actually, there was a Saturday Night Live skit about that where Reagan pods were being passed around and Carter's speeches were putting everybody to sleep and they were all becoming Reagan voters. But anyways, we will be discussing this again in the future, but that closes out this segment for now.
Eeny, meeny, chili beanie, the spirits are about to speak.
Are they friendly spirits?
Friendly? Just listen.
All right, this brings us to predictions. Dave, what do you have?
I'm going to try to stick with my general practice lately of predicting on something from our show today, and that spending deal, the passing the budget. I tend to think that the speaker is showing through words and deeds he does not want to shut down. He wants to maintain his speakership, and he's going to do everything that he can to be persuasive enough to bring as many of those Freedom Caucus folks along. Maybe some promises from the Biden administration to shore up border funding would take that over the line, and I think that's what we're going to end up seeing. They might have to temporarily do some kind of short-term continuing resolution because the 19th is only a week or so away. But my prediction is that we will see a budget deal very shortly.
All right, I'll be real quick on this. The Colorado case going to the Supreme Court, I believe it's going to be overturned, but the SCOTUS majority is going to definitely avoid questions as to whether or not Trump was part of an insurrection or even some of the more broad constitutional issues. It's going to be on a procedural issue. They're going to wimp out and violate their own concept of textualism or strict construction. They're going to say that states basically have no jurisdiction until Congress writes enabling legislation, which is a profound statement about the failure of Congress over the past century and a half. But that is my prediction as to what they're going to do, because they will not keep Trump off the ballot in those states. So with that, we will be discussing these and other issues in the future. Until then, stay informed and stay engaged.